En parlant un peu de Paris, tout s'éclaire et tout vous sourit. La cité morose se métamorphose, les vieux murs semblent moins gris.
In this video I'm going to talk a little about the idea of emojis as a universal language. But before getting to this, I want to have a quick look at the idea of a universal language more generally. Just outside Kyoto there are the headquarters of Oomoto, one of what are known as Japan's new religions. Oomoto was founded at the end of the 19th century and it's based on Shinto beliefs and rituals, but one striking element about the practices it follows is that it's adopted Esperanto as its official language. Esperanto is a constructed language which was invented by Ludwig Zamenhof in the late 1800s. The idea behind it is that it can be used as an additional language alongside people's native languages, and because it doesn't belong to any one nation, it's thus culture free and can therefore be used as a neutral international language. According to the history of the Oomoto religion, when one of their spiritual founders first heard about Esperanto, he considered it to be the language of heaven. Today, the religion promotes the language through various conferences and publications, and they even revere the founder, Zamenhof, as one of their saints. On their website, they explain why it is that they've adopted Esperanto as their official language. They say, in the reconstructed world, there will be no political or religious strife or competition. All will work for the same goals of peace, harmony and prosperity for the planet and all its inhabitants. A neutral, universal language, in addition to each person's native tongue, is essential to achieving this goal. The idea that a universal language is the secret to world peace is one which reoccurs throughout history. The belief that if everyone spoke the same language, we would be able to recognise each other's common humanity more easily was the starting point for Ludwig Zamenhof himself. He wrote, "We believe that communication and relationships based on a neutral base will do away with the great mass of brutality and crimes which are caused not by ill will but simply by mutual misunderstandings." And it's an idea that's still promoted today by people like Mark Zuckerberg, who said that Facebook's mission is the power for people to share all of the things that they care about, what they're thinking about, what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And the idea is that if everyone has the power to share those things, then that makes the world more understanding. Although the reality, at the moment at least, as far as social media is concerned, is almost the exact opposite of this. It's a mixture of polarisation, fake news, offence culture, and that sort of thing. But still, this ideal lives on, and because natural languages themselves are so tied up with national identity and culture, emojis have been frequently put forward as a possible universal language. But what do we actually mean by universal in this sort of context? Back at the turn of the millennium, when the concept of globalization was at the heart of most theorizing about what was going on in the world, a popular case study was to look at the way that McDonald's operated in different countries. McDonald's had built its business on standardization. The design, the menu, the approach to customer service were always exactly the same wherever you went. It was a symbol of Western capitalism which had spread since the 1990s from Red Square to downtown Mumbai. It was an emblem of the globalized world we were now living in and of how globalization brought with it a form of cultural homogenization. The same graphics, the same food, the same low wages wherever you went in the world. But one of the things that made this a particularly interesting case study for students of globalization was that in amongst the homogeneity and the one-size-fits-all branding, there was a little acknowledgement of local cultural difference. The franchises would incorporate a few elements of the local cuisine into their menus. So in Japan, for example, you'd have teriyaki burgers, while in France you could buy alcohol along with your meal. This was globalization with a small concession towards the local. It was what was sometimes referred to as glocalization. The reason for including this slight digression is that there's an interesting contrast between this and emojis. As I say, one of the assertions often made about emojis are that they're a universal form of communication. But in what way exactly are they universal? One way is that they're used pretty much all around the world today. And not only that, but they look the same all around the world. It's simply not possible to adapt or customize them. The basic design is regulated by a central committee known as the Unicode Consortium. So from this point of view, they're more homogenized than McDonald's. They're a product of globalization with no concession towards globalization. But does this mean they're actually universal? The issue of culture is important here. Let me start with an example. This is Apple's emoji for a backpack. I need to give a brief bit of context here first. So each platform has its own designs based on a prototype design specified by the Unicode Consortium. So Apple's backpack is basically the same as, say, Google's, but it has a slightly different design. In addition to this, companies tend to update their designs every now and again. So, as I say, this is the Apple backpack, or at least this is what it looked like in 2016. For anyone from or familiar with Japan, this is a randoseru. The use of this design is due to the fact that emojis were first invented in Japan. The original sets of emojis were created by Japanese telephone companies in the late 1990s. And this history is responsible for the existence of a large number of emojis which have a specifically Japanese theme or look. So there are Japanese customs such as koinobori, hinamatsuri, tsukimi. There's also a lot of Japanese food. There's matcha, oden, dango, narutomaki, omusubi, nigiri, bento. There's a Japanese castle, and there's the tori from a Shinto shrine. The post office has a particular Japanese look, and there's even a love hotel. And there are various other ways in which Japanese culture is reflected in the design of the emojis. The randoseru backpack is similarly a product of this history, or at least it was until 2016 when Apple changed their design to make it less culturally specific. Whereas emojis started as a Japanese phenomenon, they became a global phenomenon when the big technology companies, and particularly Google and Apple, decided they wanted to integrate them into their own platforms. The big shift came when Apple included emojis in its operating system for the iPhone in 2011. But again, the concept of global isn't straightforward here. What's noticeable is that the companies and organisations that facilitated the global spread of emojis are mostly based in the USA. And not only that, they're mostly all based on the west coast of the USA. The Unicode Consortium, for example, is based in Mountain View, California, and from here it regulates emojis all across the world. And as the example of the backpack shows, these US-based multinational companies then get to decide what counts as culturally neutral. Over the last few years, the Unicode Consortium has tried to make emojis more culturally inclusive. First, they added more female emojis. Then they added skin tones to represent different races. They included same-sex couples and gender-neutral characters, as well as various different foods from around the world. But all the while, this is a vision of what diverse and inclusive global culture looks like from the perspective of the West. It's impossible to create emojis which fully represent the full diversity of global culture, because the diversity of global culture is almost infinitely rich. So, what does all this mean for the idea of emojis as a universal language? Well, firstly, emojis, as with any human language, have their roots in a particular history. And for this reason, they're full of cultural inflections. Another good example is the crossed flag emoji, which, like lots of the early emojis, represents Japanese national culture. In 2016, Samsung, a Korean company, decided they wanted to wrest it away from Japanese national culture, so replaced it with two South Korean flags. But of course, that just replaces one specific culture with another. So we can never get entirely away from culture when we're communicating, because it's baked into the resources we use to communicate. There are certainly some things that are universal symbols across the globe. A smiling face or a frowning face express much the same emotions in the USA as they do in Japan. But other things, such as gestures, are more culturally specific. The OK sign, for example, became a source of controversy a few years ago when it was adopted by the alt-right as a white supremacist symbol. For some people today it still just means okay, while for others it's a symbol of hate. And this is the thing with language generally, as well as with emojis. Its meaning comes ultimately from the way people use it. Even a smiley face can, in certain contexts and with certain communities, take on an ironic meaning and thus express something very different from happiness. Culture plays a hugely important part in our lives, but it's not something fixed with a set of unbreakable rules. There are hundreds of emojis which will have specific meanings for particular communities. But then we don't need a culturally neutral language to be able to communicate freely with people from around the world. We just need to be aware that even when we're using the same language, we're doing so within the context of our own cultural background and beliefs. And that these cultural differences are an opportunity for exploring the diversity of the world, and that culture is something we all participate in and help shape ourselves through interaction and conversation with others.
La Madeleine et la place Clichy sont perdues en livres, on se sent revivre en parlant un peu de Paris.